Hello and welcome to another lecture of biology. So we're going to be talking about concepts of biology today, just to kind of focus you in on some general things that you might have forgotten about in general bio. So now we're going to remind you of these little concepts because we're going to talk about them again and again throughout the semester. So it's always important to kind of go back and remember what we've already learned so that we can put it to new uses. So that's what we're going to do right now. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about concepts of biology part 1 and part 2. Alright, so hopefully you guys remember back in the day when we were talking about macromolecules. That's an introductory biology class kind of thing. When you're talking about macromolecules, basically what you're talking about is your proteins, your carbohydrates, your lipids or your fats, and then your nucleic acids. So we're going to breeze through these real quick. And again, if it seemed like I'm going a little bit fast, that's because you guys should have already learned all this. So this is just kind of like a reminder of what's going on. Alright, so let's talk about our 4 macromolecules. Alright, so why macromolecules are so important is because essentially it makes up us. Everything that we are is a type of macromolecule. So my muscles are proteins, my blood is proteins, my DNA is nucleic acids, the cholesterol in my system are going to be lipids, my energy is carbs. So all of this is like really important stuff for us, especially being animals. Now, there's a couple different ways that we utilize this energy that we get because we are not plants and we can't make our own energy. So we actually have to go out and eat stuff to get our energy. And hopefully you guys can remember this. Do you remember that energy is not created nor destroyed? It's just transferred. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. So when we're making, and we're going to learn about this in the next couple lectures when we're talking about chemistry, when we're making chemical bonds, right, we're forming bonds, we're actually storing energy in said bonds. When we break that bond, say if we were to digest our food and break up our food, we're then releasing those bonds. So this is a classic example of synthesis and then basically breakdown. So synthesis is just a big fancy word for creating. So if you were to synthesize DNA, you're creating DNA, or really you're making more copies of your DNA. If you're to synthesize things like sugar, like plants do, you're creating your sugar. Now, you don't just create it like that from scratch, right? You're taking the things that are already naturally found in the environment and you're taking the energy and creating a bond. Okay, so that would be things like glucose, right? Well, that's a carbohydrate we're going to learn about in a second. Now, glucose is a really amazing sugar. It's useful for us. It's useful for plants. It's basically super useful because it's a simple sugar. Okay, so if you were to create glucose, right, you're taking the carbon and the hydrogen and the oxygen, you're sticking them together to form or synthesize sugar. Now, if you were to break that down, say, okay, so the plants made that sugar, right? They're sitting out there and they're doing photosynthesis and they're making that sugar, and then here comes a cow, right? And he comes along and eats that grass. He's just eaten the sugar that the plant just made. The cow will then go through breakdown, right? And that's actually where you're going to be releasing that energy that was stored in those chemical bonds. You're going to be releasing it, okay? Releasing it back into the usable environment. So, to synthesize something, you basically take these little molecules that are just naturally found in the environment, and adding energy to them, you make complicated molecules, like these macromolecules we're about to talk about. Right? These are macromolecules. Macro means big. These are big molecules. It takes a lot of energy to make these big molecules. Now, if I were to say, eat a cheeseburger full of that protein and that carbs and those lipids, right, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down and release that energy. So it's a cycle of just creating these larger complex molecules and then breaking them down. Creating these larger complex molecules and then breaking them down. That's all it is. It's an energy transfer. Okay. Oops. Now, when we're talking about carbohydrates, which is our first macromolecule, we're talking about your carbs. And you guys should know what carbs are, right? If you eat some bread, that's got carbs in it. If you eat more complicated carbohydrates, right, complex carbohydrates, those are things like starches. And we're going to see why that is in just a second. But essentially, carbohydrates are just sugars, right? And so if you've ever been on a diet or you're trying to lose some weight, they always say, like, cut out the sugars. They actually want you to cut out carbs, too, because carbs are just chains of sugars. Now, sugar can be great. It's a really amazing source of energy, right? If you guys have ever had, like, a Red Bull or something with a lot of sugar in it, you're like, oh, my God, woo! But then you end up crashing because it's not long-term energy, it's short-term energy. So if you were to say carbo load, I'm sure you guys have heard that before, like you carbo load before you go run a marathon, you're eating a bunch of carbs. And that's really good because it's short-term energy. And your body's like, yes, I have all this energy. But if you don't go run said marathon, then your body's actually going to store those carbs as fat. Okay, so that's why they say if you're trying to lose weight or something like that, cut out the carbs. And this is not every diet. Some of them are like, go carbs. You just have to kind of balance them out because if you burn off the energy, great source of energy, super useful. If you don't burn off the energy, then it can kind of get stored as not so good stuff like the fats. I mean, and fats are great, so don't get me wrong, fats are not bad. There are good fats, and we're going to learn about those in just a second. All right, so most of these carbohydrates, like I said, are used for energy, right? If you want some energy, especially in the morning, that's usually why you eat like oatmeal or bran cereal or stuff like that. A lot of carbs in that. It's usable energy throughout the day, which is super great. An example of the sugar that we talked about is glucose, right? C6H12O6. Hopefully you guys know that. If not, maybe learn that one. It's not super hard. But it is in what's called a 1:2 to 1 ratio. So 6 to 12 to 6 is just a 1 to 2. So that's what that means. Don't worry about that. You're like, what are the ratios? Don't worry about that. All right. So a lot of our carbohydrates are short-time energy. Now, if we don't want them for short little bursts of energy, and say if you're like a plant and you want to store energy for later use, you store that as starch. And starch is one of those complex carbohydrates that I talked about. It's complex because it's a long chain of little tiny sugars all in a row. Now remember, the sugar molecule itself has all of those bonds to make the sugar. Here, I'll click back for just a second. Okay? So see all these little lines? And we're going to learn this when we go back to chemistry. All these lines are bonds. All those bonds are storing energy. So if we were to take the sugar and break up all those bonds, that's a lot of energy for us. Aha. Now, imagine we take all those little tiny sugar molecules and we stick them in a long chain. That's a starch, right? So that's why starches are long-term energy, because it's going to take a lot more energy and time to break all those starch molecules down, right? Because it's a big long chain. You got all those bonds to break. Oh my God, so many bonds. Now, this starch is actually really good. So yes, it's found in things like potatoes, right? Those French fries are all full of starch, long chains of sugar. But great for energy, but it's also really important for structure. So if you are a plant, yes, you need to create glucose, and yes, you need to store your energy as starch for later use. Maybe it's winter time, right? There's not a lot of sun, so you can't do a lot of photosynthesis. You have all those starches, you can slowly break them down and have all that energy for longer periods of time. But not just that, they use them for structure. So things like chitin and cellulose are both made of these carbohydrates. So I could ask you, what's an example of a simple sugar or a simple carbohydrate? You tell me glucose. I could ask you, what's the example of a complex carbohydrate, or what's called a polymer, right? Not a monomer, which would be one like glucose, but if you stick them in a chain, then you have a polymer like starch. Okay, starchy compounds like chitin and cellulose, right? So chitin is found in things like decapods, and basically arthropods, and their shells. Okay, so they're absorbing all of that chitin, and that's how they get that nice hard exoskeleton, which is protection for them. So it's super important for them. Otherwise, they'd just be eaten alive by anything that swims by. Now, cellulose, hopefully you guys remember cellulose, like your cellulose cell wall in a plant, that's going to give it that rigidity, that structure, right? So you don't want to just not fall down and I can't grow. Well, you're a plant. You need to grow up into the sunlight, and therefore you need to be able to have a little resilience. And that's what that cellulose is good for. It kind of like bulks you up a little bit. Proteins. Proteins are by far the most diverse of all the macromolecules. So there are so many different types of proteins. Proteins do everything. Like our body is basically all just proteins, giant proteins. Right? Our muscles are proteins, our hair is proteins, our freckles actually are proteins. What? Yes, the pigment in your skin is made of proteins. The blood that's circulating in your system, all protein. So proteins are really, 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 really important. Right? That's why they say even if you're like a vegan or a vegetarian, you still need to get your proteins from somewhere else, because we reuse all those little amino acids. Okay, so the monomers for proteins are going to be amino acids. Like the monomers for carbohydrates was sugar, right? The monomers for proteins are going to be amino acids. So amino acids are basically just these tiny little molecules floating around in our body, that we also find in our food, that when you stick together in certain sequences build certain proteins. Okay, this is all based on your DNA. So your DNA is kind of like the instructions, and we're going to get there, but they tell you what proteins to make. So I have kind of curlyish, wavyish hair. That's because, well, not right now, I straightened it. But normally, you'll see, don't worry. Normally I do have curly wavy hair. That's my protein. So based on my DNA, my protein comes out as a curly, wavy hair. Now proteins are, like I said, very, very diverse. And so some of the functions include basically these catalysts. So a catalyst means to speed up a reaction. So catalysts in our body are typically known as enzymes. So we have a lot of enzymes in our body that kind of like help all these reactions go forward. We're big and complex and we're moving around all the time. And therefore, to be this big and complex, you need chemical reactions happening. You need energy flowing. That's what these enzymes are going to be helpful for. They kind of speed up these reactions. So we're not slow, we're like, right? Thanks to these enzymes, which are just proteins. Okay, so again, an example of like a larger protein. So remember, monomer, simple protein, amino acid. Big, complicated protein, enzyme. Okay. What else? Some of them are basically chemical messengers. So maybe they're not catalyzing a reaction, but they're triggering something to happen. So something in your brain is going to go beep, dee, 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 and send it all the way down to your body so it reacts. Okay, so those are chemical messengers, contacting cell to cell to cell to actually get something to happen. The other ones are things like structure, like I said, our muscles, our bones, all made out of proteins. Immunity, oh my god, we have things like, we have hormones, we have our basically our transportation proteins going on inside of us. All of these things are internally regulated, but they're all made up of proteins. And like I said, internal transport, things like transport vesicles like blood, right? That's a transportation. It's actually a type of connective tissue, which again is just a type of protein. So it's connecting us all over. It's just all proteins. Just really awesome. I'm not going to tell you too much about the folding of the proteins. All you really need to know in here is that, you have a single amino acid. You put them in a long chain, just like our starch, right? With our sugars. Put them in a long chain that's known as a primary structure. You take that long chain and you start to fold it in on itself, right? As it starts to bond, we're going to get things like our secondary structure. You either have the double helix or you have what's called the pleated sheet, kind of like a stepladder almost. And then you're going to have things like the tertiary proteins, which are basically the double helix and the little pleated sheet. They're just kind of making this big ball of protein. And then finally you have your quaternary protein, which is four of those little ball proteins all stuck together to make a large protein. That would be things like our muscles, our red blood cells, our enzymes, stuff like that, large functioning proteins. All, again, just made up of tiny little amino acids. All right, lipids. Lipids are our fats. So you'll either hear lipids or fats or oils. Those are all kind of synonymous with each other. It's all basically the same thing. Excuse me. Now, lipids are really important. Yes, they are a source of energy. So if you break down your fat, you actually have a lot of energy. That's why bears and stuff get really big in the wintertime, because then they hibernate and then their body just uses all of that energy that's stored. So fats are not necessarily bad. Fats can also be really good because they're hormones. So your sex hormones like testosterone or estrogen, as well as all these other different hormones like growth hormones and luteinizing hormones, and all these hormones inside our body are all essentially at their base fats. Okay, so that you've heard of the good fats and the bad fats. You want the good fats because they turn into things like hormones, which you need because that kind of controls what's going on in your body. And otherwise, if you didn't have hormones, you would die. And then you're thinking like, my hormones are going crazy, I don't want hormones. You do, they sometimes just ramp up a little bit and make you a little nutty. But hormones are still really, really good. All right, what else? Oh, another super important thing that lipids do is they create membranes. Hopefully you guys remember what a membrane is. It's kind of like a barrier. So in your cell, you have a plasma membrane because you don't want random things floating into your cell. You also don't want random things floating out of your cell. What if you're like, oh, there goes my nucleus, oh no, you don't want that. So it kind of creates this barrier. And it creates a barrier because part of it is hydrophobic and part of it is hydrophilic. Okay, so hydrophobic means water hating or water fearing. And hydrophilic means water loving. So you love water. So part of it loves water and the other half doesn't love water. So it kind of stands up, and you can kind of see this. I don't know if I can see this one. Can't really see it in here. Anyway, so you basically have a hydrophilic head that loves water and hydrophobic tails. And so what they do is they kind of orient themselves with all the hydrophilic on the top and all the hydrophobic on the bottom. That means if you have water on the top, you're good, because that part of the lipid is touching the water, it's okay. But you won't have any water that passes through or leaks out, because the hydrophobic tails are like, nope, no water here, you can't come through water, sorry. So that actually prevents water from getting through. So a lot of these marine organisms will actually protect themselves with that lipid layer because it doesn't allow the water through. So things like temperature, you actually get a little bit of insulation, right? Think insulation of like a fat little seal up in the Arctic. Super cute, just big old squish face. Adorable. So lipids are good for that too. But again, they also help to repel water. So some kind of developing organisms will actually have little bits of oil in their egg to keep their egg afloat. Because remember, oil floats on water. And so therefore, instead of sinking all the way to the bottom where they're going to get eaten by something, they stay up near the top because of that little bit of oil. So oil is super useful for many different marine organisms. And we're going to talk all more about that coming up. Let's see. Oh, this is actually pretty cool for birds. Birds will actually coat their feathers. I mean, they don't actually like paint it on coat. It's just naturally like oils being secreted. But they will actually kind of like secrete this oil along their feathers so that when the water touches their feathers, they don't actually get the feathers wet because oil was going to repel the water. So if you think of like penguins and stuff like that are swimming in this freezing Arctic waters, they're not actually touching the water. It almost creates like this little bubble inside the oil, and it bounces the water right off. In fact, if you've ever seen like a penguin underwater swimming at the aquarium or something like that, you see little bubbles coming off of them. That's because it's little bubbles trapped in between their feathers. They don't even get wet. How cool is that? Very cool. Okay. We already talked about insulation. Remember the little fat seal? Little cutie pie, right? But he does have a nice fat layer, a blubber layer, and that's going to keep him nice and warm. Blubber is also really, really nutrient rich, and that's because it's got all this energy, right? It's got all these like fat little bonds that you can break and release all this energy. So we're going to talk about this later on, but sharks, fun fact, especially those big predatory sharks like white sharks and stuff like that, they don't want to eat your meat. They want to eat your fat, which is why they go after seals and sea lions and whales, because they all have that fat layer, that big blubber. In fact, if you ever see a shark feeding on a whale carcass, they go up and they strip off the blubber and they leave the meat. The meat is tough and you gotta chew it, and yeah, it's proteins and it's good for you, but the fat is like, you can break that down like that, easy energy, right? So that's why they go for things like that, or like the fatty livers of things, because they're like, yeah, give me the fats. My stomach can only hold so much, so I'm going to get a lot more calories there than there. I'm going to eat that fat. I know, crazy. Another reason sharks don't like humans. We don't have the blubber. I mean, we have, but not nearly what they want. They want big, thick, fat layers of just fat. It's crazy. Okay. We already talked about hormones. We already talked about energy. We talked about all this. Getting to our last of the macromolecules. Now we're going to be talking about nucleic acids. So the base unit of the nucleic acid is a nucleotide. So a nucleotide is your DNA. Remember your ATCs and your Gs, right? All those are nucleotides. So essentially what you're doing is you're putting them together in a very specific sequence, and that sequence will get read by things like ribosomes, which will tell you what proteins to make. So your instructions all came from your DNA. What proteins you have for your hair is going to come from your DNA. Your freckles, right, those are proteins that are made based on your DNA. Okay, so all of this is nucleic acid. It's like genetic information is what it is. Or hereditary information, heritable information, all that kind of stuff. It's all passed down, right? Your genes come from your parents, right? So their genetic information got combined and passed to you, right? And then that's what gave you your traits. All based on their instructions, which is pretty cool. So here you can see the DNA double helix, and again, it gets tightly wound up around these nucleosomes. You don't need to know any of this. Wound again, wound, turn into these chromosomes right here, and this one chromosome will contain all of your DNA. It's crazy, right? And then again, they'll get replicated, they'll split in things like cellular replication, and then that's what turns you into you. Weird. Okay. All right, so that was macromolecules. Hopefully that kind of just, reminded you guys of what some of these macromolecules are and brought you back to intro biology and stuff like that, because we are going to talk about them again, but really that's just like a review session of things you should already know. So now let's talk about things that you might not remember. Hopefully you do, but we're going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. Things like photosynthesis. All right. So we talked about energy, right? We talked about how energy is not created nor destroyed, just transferred. Okay, this is really important because this energy transfer is what makes life life. Literally, you can't have life without energy. Where would we get the energy to live from? We actually all get it. Every single thing on the planet, asterisk, almost, gets it from the sun. Okay, so the sunlight is basically beaming down energy towards us, right? And then plants are able to absorb said energy and store them in things like sugar and salt, sugar and starches. Then we eat those plants, or we eat something else that eats those plants, and then we get that energy. Energy gets transferred from the plant to the herbivore to us. When we die, right back to the herbivores. Well, to the plants who are then going to get eaten by the herbivores and all sorts. It's just the circle of life. Okay? All right, so remember that most organisms on the planet, not every one, there are things like deep hydrothermal vents that have no sunlight, so they're not getting their energy from that. There's whole ecosystems that survive in caves, never see any sunlight. They're not dependent on that. So you can't say all, but most organisms on the planet all depend on the sun to get their energy. Indirectly, of course. We don't just sit out there and go, photosynthesis. Because we're not built like that. But we do eat things that do photosynthesis, and that's how we get their energy from them. Now, photosynthesis, remember, synthesis just means to create. So photosynthesis means to create with light. So in this case, we're creating sugars with the help of light. And that's where we get the energy from, light energy. Now, autotrophs do photosynthesis. Auto means self. Troph means feeder. Food, feeder, kind of thing like that. So self-feeder, right? We are not autotrophs. We cannot produce our own food. We are heterotrophs, or different feeders. And therefore, we have to go out and find our food from somewhere else, our energy from somewhere else. But, plants and algae are autotrophs. Ooh, excuse me, gross. Plants and algae, this is what you get for recording hours of video in your kitchen with no one here. You get weird, awkward, anyway. Okay, plants are autotrophs. Plants are making their own food, right? So plants, algae, anything that is photosynthetic is going to be making its own food. Okay, hence autotroph, self-feeding. Now they do this with the use of pigments. Now chlorophyll is a pigment that captures light. So it's also the thing that makes the plants green. So any plant that is green has a lot of chlorophyll in it. We are not green, so we don't have any chlorophyll. Okay? So these chlorophyll are these little light-capturing pigments that takes it and basically gets their electrons really, really excited, and then they transfer those electrons around and around and around, transferring energy. Finally, they transfer it into a bond to actually create things like sugar. Okay, so that's the gist of how it works. Are we going to go into this? You should have already learned this, so no. If you were in my intro bio class, yes, we are going to learn this, and if you want to review, just go to my YouTube page and check out photosynthesis, because I got a whole lecture on it. Anyway, so this energy that we're actually using is turned into, so that we're absorbing from the sun, is turned into carbohydrates. Remember, plants make sugar, okay? Now, plants not only make the sugar, they then have to break that sugar down to consume it. And you're like, wait, why wouldn't you just keep the, what? It seems kind of redundant, but that's how plants do it, right? They first have to make the sugar, then they break the sugar down into usable bits of energy. I know. We skip that step. We don't bother making our own food. We just eat something, and then boom. Now we break that thing down into usable bits of energy. But plants do it all in 2 steps. Silly, but they do. Now during this, they actually absorb CO2. So to do the chemical reactions that they need to create that glucose molecule, they need to absorb CO2, which is great for us because CO2 is really nasty and we hate it, but plants love it. Very mutualistic relationship. We're both benefiting because we happen to exhale CO2. They absorb CO2. They release oxygen. We absorb oxygen. It's this beautiful relationship between us and plants, which is why we need things like forests and kelp forests and algae, and they're producing all of our oxygen. Otherwise, we would suck up all the oxygen out of the atmosphere and that's it. There'd just be no more oxygen. You just sucked it all up. Okay? So this is really great for us. They produce oxygen and they absorb CO2. That is the exact opposite of what we do. We absorb oxygen and release CO2. Okay? So again, beautiful circle of just us moving stuff back and forth with these plants. It's great. All right, here's exactly what you see right here. So we have solar energy. It's basically going to shine down on this little piece of algae in the form of photons. These photons essentially are going to cause some chemical reactions to happen with the help of our enzymes, which, remember, speed up chemical reactions. And you're going to take atmospheric CO2. You're going to take a little bit of water, which is why plants and algae need water, right? And then you're going to, with said energy that you got from the sun, absorbed in the chlorophyll. I know you're following along. And then you're going to turn it into glucose. Okay, that glucose is usable bits of energy now, right? So you took sun energy, which isn't really useful for anything except a plant or an algae, and you turned it into usable bits of sugar, which now pretty much everything can use. Thank you, plants and algae. As a byproduct, what is released with the plant's like, I don't need that, I don't want to get rid of it, is oxygen. Again, another really useful thing for us. So that oxygen is released into the environment. So again, the sun hits the chlorophyll. The chlorophyll is where all the chlorophyll again in the chloroplast. The chlorophyll is the pigment that's absorbing the sunlight. It basically goes through this chemical reaction. Because of it has all that energy to react, it takes CO2 with water and then it releases oxygen and glucose. Whew. Photosynthesis. I have a whole hour lecture on that, if not more. All right. So remember we already talked about the differences between autotrophs and heterotrophs. Auto means self, troph means feeder, so autotrophs are your plants and your algae or anything photosynthetic. There are photosynthetic bacteria that are autotrophs, self-feeders. Okay, if you are not photosynthetic or self-feeders, because we're going to talk about a few more later on in the semester, then you are heterotrophic, which means you need to go out and eat something. And I can tell you that all animals on the entire planet are heterotrophic. Nobody makes their own sugars if you are an animal. If you're a plant, yeah, you definitely make your own sugar. But if you're an animal, no, definitely not making your own sugar. You must consume sugars and energy from elsewhere. And I don't just mean sugars. Nobody lives on just sugars. You need your carbs and your proteins and your lipids. You need to consume those. But I'm just simplifying because of the plants and the algae, and they're making sugar. So. Okay. When we actually eat said cheeseburger and we start to break down that matter, that is known as cellular respiration. Okay, we've taken that big glucose molecule and we're breaking those bonds, releasing that energy, and now we turn it into what's called ATP. And ATP is cellular energy. We are made up of millions and billions of cells, and therefore they all need little bits of energy. And they can't use that cheeseburger that you just ate. Doesn't help them. They need ATP. And so that's what we're doing. When we break those bonds, we're releasing the ATP out of it. When we make those bonds, we're kind of storing ATP. So you can kind of think of that. And it's not exactly 100% how it works. But again, if you want to watch exactly how that works, you can go back and watch my cellular respiration video on my YouTube page. So just click on cellular respiration, biology with Stephanie, you'll find it. And no, these are not shameless plugs. Really, if you need help, go watch it. Otherwise, your teacher should have hopefully already taught you this in regular biology. Okay. So cellular respiration essentially is the opposite of photosynthesis. Instead of taking water and CO2 and making sugar and oxygen, we take sugar and oxygen and turn it into water and CO2. Again, this beautiful cycle between us and plants, right? It's the exact opposite, okay? You're just going in reverse, taking that sugar that we just made and chopping them down. Remember, plants do cellular respiration. First they build the sugars, then they have to break them down and turn them into ATP. They don't break them all down, of course, because remember cellulose, they use it for structure. Okay, so plants are using sugar for structure and energy. We're pretty much just using sugar for energy. But remember things like chitin, which we're going to see a lot of this semester. Chitin is made by arthropods, and they use that for structure as well. So not all animals just need it for energy. Sometimes they need it for structure as well. I know. Thank God you have me on video because I talk really fast. You can just pause me or rewind me and just go back. I know. It's great. Nobody else gets to do this in the rest of the semester. They just have to deal with this. All right. I get very excited when I'm talking marine biology. What can I say? Okay. Here's again, cellular respiration, the exact opposite of photosynthesis that we just learned about. So we have things like, what are we doing? We're taking in the oxygen, right? We're breaking it down via cellular respiration. We're releasing the chemical energy, turning it into ATP, and we release out CO2 and water, right? If this is a plant cell, they're then going to take up that H2O and that CO2 through photosynthesis. They're going to absorb that solar energy, turn it into glucose and oxygen. So again, these are two just opposite processes, right? That's kind of that synthesis and breakdown that we talked about. Photosynthesis is the synthesis part, and then cellular respiration is the breakdown part. Okay, so breakdown and synthesis both requires energy, but also, releasing energy as well. So two very, very good things. All right. So remember, carbohydrates are, if you carbo load and you ate all those carbs, but then you didn't run the marathon, it'll actually turn into fats. And you're like, wait a minute, I thought you were sugars. How can you now be lipids? Well, essentially, these are all just made out of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. So a lot of the times, all you need to do is just kind of rearrange that little molecule, and now you're a protein or a lipid or even a nucleic acid. So carbohydrates are very important. They're like, not the base molecule, but kind of, because they're a building block for other things. Once you create that glucose, now you have CO2, now you have carbon and hydrogen and oxygen that you can turn into things like proteins or lipids or whatever else you need. So again, very, very important to always have these sugars, which is why I always use sugar as a classic example of what we need. We need all of these things. We would die without all these things. But it's, one of these things that can be modified into these other things, whereas pretty much a protein is going to stay a protein once it's a protein, right? You're not going to go from a protein to a lipid. No, but you can go from a lipid to carbohydrate to a protein. Okay. All right. Now, how do I want to say this? All right, so we have, back to our autotrophs. So we're talking about our photosynthetic bacteria, our algae, and our plants. Now, these guys are known as primary producers because they're producing this energy that's not only for us, not only for them, but for us, for everything. So they're kind of the base level of the energy. So primary means first, and producer means they actually produced energy. So usually what we're talking about now is we're going to talk about a trophic pyramid or an energy pyramid. Okay, so the bottom level, the base level, the biggest level are your primary producers, your plants, your algae, and your photosynthetic bacteria. They're the first producers. Okay? Now there's no second producers, there's no third producers, this is it. There's just primary producers. They're the first and only producers. But we do have things like primary consumers. So a primary consumer is going to eat the primary producer. Okay? See if I can I'm going to draw a diagram for you guys so you can actually see this. I'll probably post it on the Canvas site. So if I haven't done that, remind me. I'll draw a little picture for you guys. Okay, so we basically have this primary producing level. Okay, they're producers, so they're all the autotrophs. They're the ones producing the energy. The consumers are just consuming energy. And you have primary consumers, which are going to eat. So let's go, this is a classic example. We have algae, right? We're in the marine environment. So we have algae as our primary producers. Now, we have things like zooplankton, those little tiny animals, right? They're going to eat the algae. The zooplankton would be primary consumers. Okay, then you have small fishes. Those small fishes are going to eat the zooplankton. Those would be secondary consumers. They're still consuming, but they're not consuming the primary producers. They're consuming the primary consumers. So it's kind of building up. And on the top level, say you have your sharks that are eating your secondary consumers. The sharks would be tertiary consumers or third level consumers, also sometimes called top predators, right? Because they're on the very top of the pyramid. Okay, so the big bottom level is always going to be your primary producers, followed by your primary consumers, followed by your secondary consumers, and then finally followed by your top predators, right? Who's really nobody's consuming them. However, once they die, then they kind of recycles back and then they do get eaten by other things. So this energy is just getting transferred. It's not created nor destroyed. It's sent to us from the sun, and then plants turn it into something that we can use, and then we eat those plants or eat something else that has eaten those plants. All right. So we talked about chitin. That's a type of structural carbohydrate. We also have things like silica. Silica is another hard structured organic compound that is made up of these different elements like carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So all of these things can be used to turn, just random elements into actual structural proteins and things that can actually be used for protection. Like a lot of mollusks will have silica shells. And so, unfortunately, as things like climate change happens, you actually have what's called ocean acidification, meaning the oceans are becoming more acidic, and it's dissolving the silica and the chitin. So that the shells of these organisms now are getting weaker because of the water pH. And that's actually causing a lot of die-off because now the predators are like, your shell doesn't mean anything, I'm just going to eat you. So these are, again, all just chemical reactions that are happening in the water, and these are some things that we really need to look out for in the future. All right, let's move on to the different types of organisms. Hopefully, again, this is all going to come back to you like, to a flashback of memories about what's happening here. We're going to be talking about different types of cells. And we're going to be talking about prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Remember, pro means before and karyot means nucleus. So before the nucleus. They don't have a nucleus. That's what we would see right here. Now, prokaryotic cells are small and very, very simple organisms. Things like bacteria that are so small you can't even see with your naked eye. Now, eukaryotic cell, eu means true, karyot means nucleus. Those are your true nucleus organisms, so they do have a nucleus, and they are much larger and much more complex. Those would be things like plants and animals, and funguses, and pretty much anything else you can see with your naked eye. Everything, they're going to be eukaryotes, because they're big. You need to have a nucleus if you're going to be big. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Now, we already learned that they do not have a nucleus, right? Prokaryot, before the nucleus. So no nucleus. They do have ribosomes, however, and we're going to remind you of what ribosomes are, but ribosomes are the site of protein synthesis. Remember, the site where proteins get made. Okay, so that's a ribosome. Now, even the little bacteria is still made of a protein, and therefore what made the protein? It's like the whole chicken and egg thing. You got to have the ribosomes to actually make the protein. So, of course, these prokaryotes have a ribosome, or ribosomes. Now, bacteria also have DNA, and you're like, what? They do. It's not big and long and complicated in the double helix like we have it. It's actually small, singular, and circular. Okay, so not big and complex and double helix, but just a small little ring of DNA. And that's because they're tiny. They don't need a lot of instructions. They're bacteria. Okay. These prokaryotes usually do have a cell wall. Where else do we find a cell wall? We find a cell wall with plant cells. Okay, so plant cells and bacterial cells both have cell walls. The only one who doesn't is an animal cell. Big, round, squishy animal cell. That's why when you poke us, we move, right? We're squishy. But if you poke that tree, it's not squishy, right? That's that cell wall. Let's see. A lot of them have a flagella, so you can think of like an animal sperm cell. You know, like the whip-like tail, that's a flagella. And that's how these little bacteria get around. And you're like, bacteria move? Yes, they do, with flagella. And all bacteria are unicellular, so there's only one. You don't have a multicellular bacteria. Now, you can have colonies of bacteria, and that's basically where they kind of like clump up and make this what looks like a larger organism. But really, it's still just individual bacteria, just all kind of clumped together. So bacteria and prokaryotes are all unicellular. Whereas all eukaryotic cells are multicellular. Asterisk, question mark. I feel like there might be an exception that I'm forgetting, like an amoeba? Anyway, okay. Let's move on. Here is just a diagram of a prokaryote. So it does have a cell wall going along the outside. It also has a plasma membrane. Remember, cell walls are for structure. Plasma membranes are to, prevent things from just leaking out of you. That's not what you want. It does have ribosomes, again, where proteins get made, as well as things like DNA, or little singular string, circular thing of DNA right here. If it is a photosynthetic bacteria, it does have photosynthetic pigments. So things like that chlorophyll that can actually absorb, not exactly like the chlorophyll, but things like the chlorophyll that can actually absorb that light energy and turn it into useful bits of energy. So, super cool. All right, eukaryotes. Plants, animals, everything else that you can possibly think of that's not a bacteria falls under eukaryote. These guys do have a nucleus, which is this kind of like protected little center area in the cell, which contains all the DNA. So that's the whole point of the nucleus, is we have so much DNA. You don't want a little bit of that breaking off. What if now all of a sudden you don't have an arm? That's not how that would work, but still, you can imagine. You don't want to lose the DNA. Those are the instructions for your arm. Okay, so you want to make sure that you keep we keep those nicely protected in our nucleus. These guys do have organelles. Now, an organelle is just a tiny organ-like structure inside the cell. So like our stomach and our liver and our kidneys all have very specific functions. Same thing as organelles, right? They all have very specific functions. And we're going to go over those in just a second in case you forgot. Eukaryotic cells can either be unicellular or multicellular. See, I knew there was one I was forgetting because I think an amoeba is just unicellular. But they're pretty cool. They do this little amoeba walk. No? See, I can't tell if you guys are laughing because I'm in my kitchen talking to my window. It's weird. I know, not ideal that we're doing this way, but thanks for sticking with me. I do appreciate it. Remember, you have the luxury of pausing me whenever you want. I know, some of you just paused me right there. It's okay. I'll allow it. All right, so we have a square-looking plant cell right here. For some reason, we also have a square-looking animal cell. It's a little confusing. Usually, they're kind of round and squishy. This is the plant cell right here. You can see the little chlorophyll or the chloroplast containing the chlorophyll. Inside here, we have a central vacuole used for storage of water, or if you're a flower, like pigments and stuff like that. We have our nucleus right here, which contains all of our DNA, and we have some other organelles that we're going to go over right here. Should you be able to identify some of these common organelles? Yes. Should you know the function of some of these common organelles? Yes. And when I make this face and I nod my head, that means it's going to be on your test, or a quiz, or a homework. I don't know. But yes, you need to know it. All right, so speaking of these organelles, let's talk about some of them. First up is the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. Hopefully you guys remember that one. This is basically the site of cellular respiration. Remember, cellular respiration is breaking down those glucose molecules into usable bits of energy. This is where we get all of our energy from. Hence, powerhouse of the cell. The Golgi complex, or Golgi body as it's sometimes called, is essentially kind of like a packaging facility. So you can almost think of like Amazon. Products are coming in and getting shipped out. So they come in, they get repackaged, and then they get shipped out where they need to go. Now, the endoplasmic reticulum, both the smooth and the rough ER, are used for packaging things like lipids and protein synthesis and packaging, stuff like that. So they're basically, the rough ER is making proteins, rough because it's covered in ribosomes. The smooth ER is worrying about lipids. And they're both doing a little bit of detoxification. Actually, no, that's mostly just the smooth ER's detoxification. But then they send, again, any lipids or proteins that they made, they send it to the Golgi body. It gets repurposed and then shot out of the cell. Or if it's coming into the cell, it has to go to the Golgi body first. Because it's like, where do you get delivered to? You got to go to the Golgi. It's like the mail. Ribosomes we already talked about. Those are the ones that are making the proteins. Chloroplast, we've definitely talked about those. That is the site of photosynthesis. So the mitochondria and the chloroplast are very, very similar. The mitochondria is making energy. The chloroplasts are making sugars, essentially. What else? We have the vacuole. Remember, it's used for storage. Things like starches are stored there. Nutrients are stored there. Water, pigments, like if you're a flower or something like that, brightly colored. Centrioles. Centrioles are really important if you remember mitosis and meiosis, right? Centrioles are kind of the things that are like helping to pull the two chromosomes apart, right? They're attached at the centrioles. Okay, so that's what they're for. Oh, here's another picture of an animal cell. This is usually more typical, big round animal cell. That's how you can always tell it's an animal cell. So again, we have the nucleus. We have the rough ER here. It's rough because it's covered in those dots. Those dots are the ribosomes. We have the smooth ER, which we can't actually see. Where's the smooth ER? Well, the smooth ER is usually around here somewhere, right next to the these two, because it's all part of the endomembrane system. Not shown here, the smooth ER. Kind of looks like this, but no ribosomes. Here we have the Golgi body. Remember, packaging stuff in and out of the cells. Here we have the mitochondria. Kind of actually look like chloroplasts, too, because there's a theory on that. Watch my photosynthesis lecture. Vacuoles are used for storage. Lysosomes are kind of like the garbage man. They're just picking up garbage and taking it out of the cell. Yeah, that's pretty much it. All right, now we are moving along to levels of organization. So I know we've talked about a lot of stuff. I know I've kind of breezed through a lot of it because remember, this should kind of be a refresher course. Like, you should have already learned all this. And again, if you didn't, you can always go back and watch my lectures on it. Otherwise, we're just remembering and it's coming back to us now. So now we're going to be moving on to levels of organization because we can go from actually a really, really low level to a really high level. And that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about levels of organization. So the very lowest level, we have things like atoms. Okay, so if you have an atom, right, you got the little nucleus with the protons and the neutrons floating around that. You have the electrons, right, the little electron cloud. Those would basically be the basis to form chemical reactions. So if you have two little atoms of oxygen, two little atoms of hydrogen, and you bring in an oxygen, what you can have is you can actually have them react to each other, create those bonds, and that's how you get a water molecule. Okay, so the very, very basis would be a single atom or an element, something like that. it can't be broken down into anything else. That's it. It's just an atom. Depending on how many electrons and protons it has, it's, hydrogen or oxygen or nitrogen, right, makes up the element. You put a couple of those elements together, now you have a molecule. So 2 hydrogen and then oxygen give us a water molecule, okay, so that can be broken down. So we're getting a little bigger here. You take a couple of these molecules, right, you make some proteins and you stick them all together. Right now you're going to have an organelle, right, like a small organ, like the mitochondria or the ribosomes or the nucleus. Those are all organelles. If you were to take all the organelles and stick them together, now you have a functioning cell, right? You actually have the cell. Say we're talking about a eukaryotic cell, right? We have all the different little organelles functioning on the inside, and now we have our little plant cell or animal cell or whatever cell we're talking about. If you take a bunch of similar cells and you stick them together, say we take a bunch of animal cells, maybe call it epithelial animal cells, we stick them together, now I have a tissue. And a tissue would be like my connective tissue, my skin, right? So when you're getting larger and larger and larger, now you're taking functioning cells and you're sticking them together to create a single purpose, right? Like a tissue. All of that tissue together, so not just this part of my arm, but my entire body's skin would be an organ. Okay, so if you take all of the tissue around your heart, right, your cardiac tissue, your cardiac muscle and all that, that would mean take all that together, that is your organ, right? That's your boom, 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 your heart. All of the skin on my body is my organ. The skin of, yes, the organ, the skin is an organ. I know it's a little confusing, but it is. If I were to take the skin and the heart and the blood and the stomach and the eye and put them all together, then I have an organ system. So let's pick one. Let's say the heart. So if I take the heart and the blood and the lungs and all the veins and arteries in my body and put them together, that is my circulatory system. Okay, so that would be an organ system. If I take the stomach and the small intestine and the large intestine and the duodenum and all of those and I stick them together, that's my digestive system. So that would be my organ system. If I take every single organ system in my body, my digestive system, my reproductive system, my respiratory system, my lymphatic system, and I stick all those together, now I have a complete organism, right? That would be me. I'm a single organism with all of my organ systems functioning together. Okay, and then finally, again, you just have the whole organism or the individual. All right, so just a reminder, we have the smallest level, the atomic level. Those are things like your elements, your carbon, your hydrogen, your oxygen. If you start combining those together, you get things like water, you get things like DNA, carbohydrates, proteins. Remember, we're building those macromolecules just by sticking together carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. Then if you were to take all of those and put them together in a singular functioning unit, you would have organelles. All the organelles make up a cell. A bunch of similar types of cells make up a tissue. All of that tissue working together makes up an organ. You get all the organs that function together, that makes an organ system. Every single organ system in the body makes up the whole organism. Hopefully that helps you guys out a little bit. And I believe we also talked about this in the introductory discussion. I don't know. We might have. I teach this so much it kind of runs together. Thank God I'm recording it. I can remember what I say. All right. Moving above that, so even farther than that, we have an individual, right? Say we're talking about all the, where are we? We are in Moore Park. I don't know what college I teach at sometimes. Say we're talking about all of the dogs here in Moore Park, right? That would be a population. You're not talking the cats and the humans and the birds, you're just talking all the dogs. You're also not talking about the dogs here and in Texas, you're just talking about the dogs here in Moore Park. All the dogs here in Moore Park is a population. All the cats here in Moore Park is a population. All the people here in Moore Park is a population. If I take all the dogs and the cats and the people and the birds and and I stick them together, that's a community. Okay, so I'm talking in the plant species and the animal species, and that's a community. And you're like, plants? Yes, you can still have a community of plants. It's all just the same species. And then finally, if you're going to be talking about all the communities there, so all the plants and the, the plants and the animals and the dogs and the cats, and you include the weather, like how much rain it gets, how hot it is usually, that's an ecosystem. So like the desert ecosystem has, snakes and lizards and cactuses and birds, and it's hot and it has little rain. That's now an ecosystem. If you're just talking about the lizards and the birds and the cactuses, that's community. But when you actually include the environment itself, that's when you're getting into the actual ecosystem part of it. And then finally, if you were to take every single ecosystem on the planet and stick them together, that's when you have a biosphere. It's even bigger. Oh, actually, I missed one. Biome. So if we were talking about every single desert on the planet, that would be the biome, the desert biome. Yes, they all have very little rain, hot temperatures. They all have some kind of reptiles and some kind of succulent plants. Are they the same? No. But they all have the same type of organism, hence biome. You have very similar conditions, you have similar community compositions, even if the exact individuals are slightly different, it's still the desert biome. Any desert you go to is basically going to look the same when it comes to, the communities that are there, because that's the only ones that can survive there. Same thing with like the coral reef biomes, right? All the coral reefs on the planet are going to kind of look like this. Well, they're going to have very, very similar species. And then if you were to take all those biomes, all the deserts in the world, all the rainforest, all the coral reefs, that's when it actually becomes the biosphere. That's Earth. Bio meaning living, sphere means circle. The living circle is Earth, planet Earth. All right, so again, we have a single organism like this crocodile right here. If we were to talk about all of the crocodiles in this swamp, that would be a population. If we're including things like the birds and the plants and all the crocodiles, that's a community. Now if we're talking about the birds and the crocodiles and the plants and the weather, that's an ecosystem. If we're talking about all marshland ecosystems, that would be a biome. So you can see we have all of these biomes right here all over the world because they're all basically the same. They're these swamp-like biomes. And then if we took every biome on the planet, that would be the biosphere. Okay, moving on to diffusion and osmosis. Let's talk a little bit about diffusion and osmosis. So hopefully you guys remember diffusion and osmosis. Diffusion is the movement of molecules, from a highly concentrated area to a less concentrated area. So it's basically going from a high concentration to a low concentration. Imagine you have a big bucket of water and you put a single drop of red dye in it. Right? That little red dye is very concentrated with red molecules. But as soon as you put it in the water, eventually it's going to dissipate out, and the whole bucket now is going to be a light pink. That's diffusion. Now, when you're talking about osmosis, you're still talking about going from a high concentration to a low concentration, but when you're talking about osmosis, you're specifically talking about water. Okay? Just water. Yeah, so here, I'll show you guys some pictures. I was going to draw this. I'll show it to you. So again, we have this drop of, say it's a sugar cube, right? We're going to drop it in the water. The sugar cube is very concentrated with sugar. Give it time, these water molecules are going to kind of surround these little sugar molecules, and they're going to begin to separate them out. So it kind of becomes uniform. That's diffusion. Okay? And basically you're just going from a high concentration to a lower concentration of whatever you're talking about. Are you talking about salt? So say we have a membrane. Okay, here's my membrane. On this side, I have a lot of salt. On this side, I have no salt. So say I have 90%, let's make this confusing. Yeah, let's do 90%, okay? So we have 90% salt over here and only 10% water, right? It's a salty, salty water. Well, the 90% salt over here is going to want to go to the 0% salt over here because 90 is bigger than 0. So the salt is going to want to go this way. Right? It's going to diffuse across the membrane until it goes over here and kind of reaches an equal concentration. Now, the water, right? So now we're not talking about diffusion anymore because we're not talking about salt. We're talking about the water. The water over here is only 10%. The water over here is 100%. Okay? So again, we're going to go from a high concentration, that 100% water, because it's just fresh water, over here to where it's only 10% water. Okay? So we're going to go from a high to a low. So meanwhile, the salts are over here going from a 90% to a 0%. The water is over here going from 100% to a 0%, or 10%. Okay, so they're actually going to go in opposite directions. As the salt moves this way, the water is going to move this way. This is true all the time. Okay, this is important because we're going to learn about fishes and stuff later who have to deal with salt concentrations. So if they have a higher salt concentration inside them than the outside environment, they're going to lose salt. Okay, as they lose salt, what's going to come in? Water is going to come in. So the salt goes out, the water comes in. Okay, and vice versa if it's the other way around. say they have a very low salt concentration, but there's a lot of salt water, right? That salt's going to flood in, which means their water is going to flood outward. Very important, because we're going to see this later on in the semester. So, we have a lower concentration on the outside than we do on the inside, okay? Lower concentration on the outside means the salt is going to come out, which means the water is going to flood in. Okay, so the salt comes out, it goes from a high concentration to a low concentration. The water goes from a high concentration to a lower concentration, so the water is going to flood in. If you have a cell, it's an animal cell, you're going to be like, you're going to explode like the chick from Willy Wonka, right? Veruca of salts with the big blueberry chick, right? That's because the water just keeps flooding in and 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 flooding in, right? You just blow up like a balloon. That's not good. Now, alternatively, say you have a higher concentration of salt on the outside than you do on the inside. In this case, the salt water is going to rush in and the fresh water is going to rush out. So in this case, you're going to lose all of your fresh water and you're going to shrivel. You're going to get dehydrated and you're like, no, all my water's gone. Okay, so really what you want is you want the same concentration on the outside as you do on the inside. That means for every little bit of salt that comes out, right, another little bit of salt is coming in. Which means for every little bit of water that comes out, a little bit of water is coming in. So you maintain a nice balance. Okay, this is known as osmoregulation. You're regulating your water concentration. Really important stuff, especially in the marine environment. Because the marine environment is salty. Which means you have to be just as salty, otherwise you're going to dehydrate. And you don't want to be less salty because then you're going to explode. Yeah, difficult to live in said marine environment. So, like I said, this is called osmoregulation. So if you are an osmoregulator, you and your body is actively regulating how much water and how much salt you have. Very important. If you're an osmoconformer, you conform to whatever the environment is, which means if it's salty, you're salty, and then you're dehydrated. So in this case, you would kind of have to live only in an area where you can survive. Okay, so whatever the outside environment is, that's what your internal environment's going to be. So if it's too salty, you're not going to be able to survive there. If it's too fresh water, and say you're a marine organism, you're not going to be able to survive there. So you can only live in a very narrow salt range. Now, if you're an osmoregulator, you can control the internal salt and water concentration. So no matter what the outside water is, you're good because your cells are actually doing the regulation. So your body is regulating that instead of just being at the mercy of the environment. So the osmoconformers are like, man, I can only live in this narrow range of salinity or dissolved salt. But these osmoregulators are like, oh, we're good. We can regulate our own salt concentration. And that means I can live in a wider salinity range. Because it doesn't matter if it's this salty or this salty, my body regulates. Very important. Okay. Now this can be done in actually several different ways. One, you can regulate how much you pee. And that sounds weird, but yeah. If you're low on water, you don't want to just be going to the bathroom constantly. You're going to lose all that water. So in that case, you'd want to secrete very little pee. Very, very little pee. And if you do, you probably want it all salty, right? You don't want any of your fresh water. You need to keep that fresh water. You just want to get rid of the salt. Okay, so you're just going to pee little bits, but it's going to be really concentrated. Now, on the other way around, if you have too much salt, if you have too little salt, then you're going to want to pee water all the time, but you're going to want to keep those salt. Remember, we need salt. You need salt to survive. So do fish, and so do other organisms like that. So if there's not enough salt around, then that organism's going to be like, cool, I'm not going to lose any of my salt. I'm going to hold on to all my salt, and I'm just going to pee out this excess water. Because I don't need all this excess water. I'm just going to keep non-stop peeing. So it depends whether you live in freshwater or saltwater, which one of these you're going to do, and I'm going to let you figure that out. I'm going to tell you right now. Anyway, so we have a marine fish, okay? A marine fish lives in a very salty environment. So you can see the salt concentration is way higher than the internal concentration, which means that salt is going to rush in. If that salt is going to rush in, he's going to dehydrate. So that's not what he wants. So that's why he's going to drink a bunch of seawater, because he's already got that salt coming in. So he's like, man, I need some of this water. So he's going to keep drinking water, and he's going to be peeing out only the salt. So it's going to be very, very minute bits of concentrated salty pee. I know, but we're talking science, so let's call it urine. And you guys are like, she said pee. Anyway, so We're going to get rid of all the salts that we can while keeping whatever water we can. Okay? Now, vice versa, if you are a freshwater fish and the water concentration of salt is very low on the outside, but it's, moderate on you, your salt is going to go outwards. You're going to lose salt. You're going to lose salt, but you're going to get water. So the water is just going to rush into your cells. So this guy does not drink at all because water's already rushing into him. But whatever little bit of salt he has, he doesn't want to pee. He doesn't want to urinate out. He wants to keep that salt. So in this case, he's actually going to just get rid of all that excess water that he's been getting while keeping the necessary and important salts that he has. So again, it depends which kind of fish you are, what you're going to do, whether you're going to be drinking water and secreting salt, or whether you're going to be keeping your salts and just peeing all the time. All right, moving on. Now, not only fish need to worry about this, but pretty much any kind of marine organism. This is a reptile, obviously it's a turtle, and they have what's called a salt gland. So some of these organisms, and birds have this too, can actually drink that salt water and then cry out or release via the salt glands the excess salt. So they keep all the water and they literally just get rid of the salt. Have you ever heard of crocodile tears? It means they're salty, right? That's because they literally cry out the salt. They keep the water and they just get rid of all the salt. Very, very cool stuff. So you can see right here, this little dribble, he's not crying. I mean, he is crying, but it's not because he's sad. No, he's totally fine. He's just getting rid of that excess salt. He's like, man, I just drank a ton of seawater, but I can cry out the salt and I can be totally fine. Do not drink salt water because we do not have this gland. You will dehydrate and die. So if you're ever stuck on the ocean, I know you're going to be tempted to do it, but don't drink it. Salt water dehydrates you. Side note, salt is a type of electrolyte. So you know those Gatorade commercials where they're like, ultimate thirst quencher. You're drinking sugar and salt, which dehydrates you. It's only important if you're an athlete and you just ran 6 miles, then yeah, have a Gatorade. If you're just walking down the street, don't drink Gatorade. It's just sugar and salt. Just, fun facts. Now you're going to learn so much from me. Random fun facts. All right, let's talk temperature control. So we talked a little bit about osmoregulation. Let's talk about thermoregulation. So you can kind of guess, thermoregulation means you can regulate your temperature. Just like osmoregulation means you regulate your water and salt concentration. Okay, so there's a couple different types of temperature control. And some of them can't do it at all. Some of them have absolutely no type of temperature control. So typically we think of that as the poikilotherms. These guys are known as the cold-blooded ones. That's not actually true at all. They don't have cold blood. They have blood. But they're at the mercy of the environment. Okay, just like the osmoconformers. Whatever the outside temperature is, that's what they are. So things like fish and reptiles, their body just mimics the outside environment. Ectotherms do generate metabolic heat, meaning as they're eating and breaking down nutrients, they do generate metabolic heat, but they can't maintain that metabolic heat. So it's pretty much when they're eating something and they're breaking it down, yeah, okay, it goes up, but then their metabolism slows and it goes down, and then it goes up and it goes down. So they're not really in charge of it. It's just kind of a byproduct of their eating, is all of a sudden, okay, they regulate a little bit. Endotherms, meaning internal, right? These guys are the thermoregulators. They're the ones like us that just maintain a steady temperature all day, every day. Even though, no joke, it's like 107 degrees outside right now, my body temperature is 98.7. Even if you feel like it's not, it is. And that's because you're an endotherm. You are regulating your body temperature, your internal temperature. Let's see. Oh, the homeotherms are different than the ectotherms because, yes, they generate metabolic heat, but they can save said metabolic heat. So instead of it going up and down, they generate it and it just stays kind of up. So the endotherms and the homeotherms are kind of similar, but this is just done metabolically instead of regulated kind of thing. All right, I'm going to stop us here, and then we're going to get to Concepts of Biology Part 2 in the next video. So thank you guys so much. Technically, we have 2 videos per week, unless you guys have an exam. So I'm going to give Part 2 as soon as I can, and you guys will have that lickety-split for our Wednesday class. So this should be Monday the 24th-ish. Remember that we have 2 meetings a week. And so we are going to be finishing part 2 on the next lecture. All right, thanks again, guys.